Alright guys, making another video of the 1-to-1 ratio. So this is a demonstration of a Banshee VGT controller. The current tune is for 1-to-1. If you guys noticed, I made quite a few videos in the last week. Each iteration of the video, there's actually the math behind the logic is just a little bit different. So in case you haven't followed, this is a 2007 Dodge 5.9. Has a common rail. I'm using a Tatter Built HE300VG. The truck is stock except for obviously the turbo. I have a Steed Speed exhaust manifold, and my lift pump's actually the new Fleece Performance lift pump, where it actually has two pumps in the gas tank, which is actually pretty cool. If anyone's ever checked it out, it's stupid quiet. You turn the key on and walk outside, you barely hear anything. If you're not even paying attention to it, you probably wouldn't honestly even notice the pump's on. So I have the cold start assist. If you guys can barely tell in the picture, it's actually snowing here in Colorado. But if you actually watch the exhaust pressure gauge will actually go up during the cranking, and then once the engine catches to 500 RPMs, it'll release the exhaust brake and idle like normal. And basically that's for when it's cold outside. It closes up the turbo in an attempt to build exhaust pressure. As you're cranking on the engine to start it over, that exhaust gas can't leave the engine, and since it hasn't really burnt, you're pretty much recycling the heat to get the cylinders a little bit warmer until it fires over, and then it releases it. If you have the wet stack prevention on, it'll actually hold it and then ramp itself out. And I'll demonstrate that. Oh, my engine's actually hot. It's 180 degrees. With the common rails, the exhaust brake won't kick on until the temperature drops down. So I have it set to 20 psi, so the Banshee controller will actually regulate it to 20 psi. If I high idle the engine, you'll build exhaust pressure, but then the turbo will open up and close and attempt to regulate 20 psi again. So like I said, this is a 1-to-1 ratio between drive pressure and boost pressure. As I drive around, you will see the exhaust pressure, which is the top number, will be higher than the boost pressure. And that's only to help light the turbo. As the turbo accelerates, your boost pressure will come up, and the turbo will regulate itself to get it back down to a 1-to-1. The problem with the 1-to-1, in my opinion, is the math behind it. I might be able to refine a little bit more. It's just it generates less of an error than if you had a 1.3 to 1 or 1.1 to 1. So the math just doesn't add up as fast or subtract as fast as if there was an offset to the 1-to-1. Even probably a negative, like a 0.9 to 1, would probably be better than a 1-to-1, mathematically anyways. Like I said, every time you hit the gas, the exhaust pressure is going to be higher temporarily, and then the controller is going to regulate it to bring it back down. Whole set turbos, in my opinion, aren't really designed for peak performance. The benefit of the whole set VGT, in my opinion, is the exhaust brake, and obviously for emission control because of the EGR range. So on a stock truck, the turbo can be tighter to help drive that EGR system, but still be able to spool the turbo to some extent without, stalling it. But as a single, like on a 5.9 or something like that, it's just as good as any other turbo. But to really get that 1-to-1 ratio, I don't think it's there. I really think it's better to drive it a little bit harder on the drive pressure than the boost, just because of the design of it. Now, if you had a VNT, like on L5P or even LOY or the Power Strokes, how I look at the 6.4s, pretty much all the other turbos other than the whole sys design. In my opinion, they are more efficient just because of the way the nozzle's pitched down. It funnels all the exhaust gas through the turbine, where this has a sliding wall technology. If it protrudes too far out, you actually block the turbine and prevent spool up. So you can only get so tight. You see videos where the guys have it all the way out and they think of the building pressure. Really all they're doing is measuring a tremendous amount of exhaust pressure, which then increases your cylinder pressure, which then when the intake valve opens, you know, it's already maxed out, so you're measuring more resistance, but in actuality your CFM through the motor is actually less. As you can see, 13.1. This truck doesn't have a wastegate. The turbo itself is the wastegate. In hindsight, I wish I paid the 200 bucks extra at Steed Speed to have them install the wastegate flange. Another idea I had, came from a customer, was to have that in there, and then once the turbo hits 100%, if you're still building exhaust pressure, you're over, you know, whatever the target is, there's nothing else that can happen. I mean, you're already maxed, the turbo's maxed out, it's not opening up. So the idea was to have the Banshee controller regulate a, basically a blow-off wastegate, and that just becomes a secondary measure for the controller. So it'd be great, especially with compounds. As a single, the odds are you're probably not going to hit 100% on the travel. I mean, at that point, you're blowing a lot of smoke. You got a tremendous amount of heat. If you're running compounds, you definitely would probably potentially hit it. If you're trying to do compound VGTs, like I've been wanting to do for a while, then you can definitely also do it. So a market I really want to get into is semis. I already have a couple of my older setups on semis, but especially in like California, all on the far west coast, the emissions are becoming more stringent. So if you have an old logging truck or even a small commuter truck where you may have to meet tighter emissions to have that older vehicle, installing these newer turbos should help with the emission control because you'll be lighting a turbo faster. From my experience with the T660, is the customers in California, he had a EGR delete and all kinds of other stuff done to the truck. The guy tuned it, the EGR, well, the turbo falls under the EGR system, so if they don't know what they're doing, they can potentially remove all the code for the turbo, and the exhaust brake no longer works and the turbo may no longer function. Well, in this case, that's what happened with the owner of the T660, and he started running my controller on it, and surprisingly the jake brake became more effective. So on the Dodge, or you know, personally on a vehicle without a jake brake, the goal is to have an exhaust brake. But with the jake brake, you have to have intake pressure, and with the exhaust brake you stall the turbo and you no longer have intake pressure. But because you can set the basically the exhaust brake position on this truck, I have it set to 100%. You can back it off to whatever you want. Eventually I might have a logic controller so you can actually regulate the PSI instead of just a percentage of the position. But anyways, on the T660, because he only set it to about 80% closed, it was tight enough when he dropped it in gear, the brake engaged, it'll actually spool the turbo up and actually increased more intake pressure than he had with the original programming, and it actually reinforced the ability of the Jake brake to slow down the vehicle. So that's kind of a cool feature that, you know, wasn't intended, it kind of just worked out. If it wasn't for the slick roads and the snow, I'd get on it harder and show you how the boost pressure trails behind the exhaust pressure on the high end, but it eventually catches up and equalizes back out. You've probably seen it a few times as I was accelerating where I wasn't really hitting too hard. That's 99,000 RPMs right there. So the goal with the Banshee controller is to be 100% universal and virtually plug and play. So on the 5.9 common rail, the only thing you really have to connect to is the, oh, looks like an accident. Oh wow. The only thing you have to connect is you have a red and black wire for your positive and your ground. You go straight to the battery, or if you want, you know, you can ground the sensor out to the body. But you just got to be careful where you put it. If you connect it where another device that has a lot of interference, that can potentially cause issues. Then you're going to have a white wire. White wire is your ignition. The ignition on just basically energizes the relay. The relay then trips and you pull power from the battery. After that, you have your engine RPM. The engine RPM connects to your best place to connect it to would actually be engine RPM sensor if you have it. What I did is I disconnected my crank position sensor, pulled out the wire that connects to the sensor, the actual return, the signal wire. Basically put a male terminal on it, heat shrunk the male terminal to the factory harness, and then put a female terminal on the other side, made like essentially a little T adapter, and plugged that back in. This way it basically jumped it across so my controller can see exactly what the engine sees. After that, you'll have, depending on which kit you order, so you have the VP44 kit, which is just one wire. If you have one wire connects to the ECU, and basically what you have is when you take your foot off the gas, it gives you 12 volts. You give it gas, it drops down to about 7. The second setup is the universal setup, and it's also the same setup for the common rail. So if you have a 5.9 common rail, you'll get the exact same kit that you would get for a P pump or for a really anything else. And you'll have two wires connected to ECU. And the whole goal is the ECU actually at that point controls the exhaust brake. You basically flip the switch, tell the ECU, hey, I want the exhaust brake, and when the engine's ready, it engages the brake for you. I got two brother-in-laws and my brother. They both, all three of them own 6.7s. And two of them right now are definitely interested in putting one of my kits on their 6.7s. So it'd be kind of interesting to see the performance of the 6.7 with the stock turbo, stock setup, and then putting a Banshee controller on a 6.7, and the only difference is the logic that controls the turbo, how much more performance, if any, comes out of it. I'm planning on, I emailed Dirt Road Diesel, Colorado Springs last night, asked them if they knew of anyone that actually had a chassis dyno that, you know, would allow diesels, and surprisingly they said they had one. So hopefully in the next week or so, I'm planning on taking my truck over there again, have them look at it, you know, so they can try to say to the best of their ability that they know it's stock, and the only thing they can see, which is what I said earlier, is the lift pump, exhaust manifold, turbo, and I have a cold air intake that's kind of trash. But I want to dyno it, have it on the 1-to-1 ratio, see how much power it makes with the 1-to-1, where it's only maxing out, you know, 25 to 30 pounds of boost, and then set it to 1.3 or to 1.5 to 1, run it again. So now, you know, if I have 30 pounds of pressure, I have 45 pounds of exhaust pressure, or, you know, if I have 30 pounds of pressure, I'm going to have 39 pounds pressure, depending on, you know, 1.3 or 1.5 to 1, to see if having a high drive pressure to help spool the turbo is actually more detrimental than having the low pressure and the low drive pressure. So believe it or not, when you're looking at the boost pressure here, that 0.2, that's actually not an error. My turbo right now is sitting at 17,000 and slowly dropping. So you're actually, the turbo's still semi-building pressure. So I'm looking at making some basic modification kits. If you have the USB adapter already on your harness, the modification kit is just going to consist of a sensor and a pigtail for the sensor. Really, you can go on Autometer. Autometer sells them already. I think they have like a 7-foot harness pigtail with their Autometer sensors. I think AEM also makes pigtails with sensors. My kit's going to be enclosed of 150-pound Honeywell sensor and the adapter. So you're looking about probably about $100 plus shipping. The sensors are like $88 if you buy it yourself, and it'll probably be about $10 or so for a 4-foot pigtail. And it'll have one Deutsch pin on it, so it connects straight into the controller, and then the other 2 wires, you're basically just going to pull back the loom, tap into the ground and 5-volt reference for your pressure sensor, and then just plug it in, you're good to go. You'll need a firmware update as well. So I don't charge for firmware updates. So if you don't want the sensor, but you just want to have the newer logic, maybe a few months when you have the summer or you have more time later on, you can add it. If you send me a controller, as long as you send it to me, I'll pay shipping, return, ground shipping back to you. But if you upgrade the kit, obviously you want to send the controller back so I can update the controller and send it all back to you at once. So as soon as you get it, you can run everything. If you have the older systems, before the USB, you had a, basically, it's what a lot of people actually still see, even though I haven't made them in like 5 or 6 years. It's a basically steel black enclosure, has 3 pots on it, and a big old push button anti-vandal LED switch. So even if you have that, you can still upgrade it because the controller is the same. So as long as you have the black controller, you can upgrade your kit. If you have the older blue ones, you'll have to basically completely get a new kit, but because you already bought one of my kits, either through third party or from me directly, I'll work with you and give you a new controller at cost. Just send me the old stuff, and then so I can get rid of it off the market, and then I'll give you a new setup at cost. But as far as removing the setup where you actually had the small black enclosure with the 3 knobs, you're going to gut a lot of the harness, and it might not look pretty when you're done. But you can easily, like I said, it'd be $100 for the sensor and the wiring harness. You also need the USB adapter. The USB adapters are roughly, I think, about $30. And from there, you'll have to do a little bit of trickery with the wiring, but as long as you can solder and get some heat shrink, it'll be fine. I have a customer that I was talking about doing this to just the other day, and I used to do it for people, have them send me the harness and I would modify them, but it was just taking up too much of my time. Or you can just buy a brand new harness for roughly $200 or so. Hope you guys liked the video. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. And just to highlight, as you can see now, my boost pressure is 0, and my turbine speed is now 13,000 RPMs. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to call or text me. My website's steeds.tech, www.steeds.tech. Feel free to email if you have any questions. If you're in Colorado Springs and Colorado, or if you're passing through and you just want to see the system firsthand, like I said, feel free. If as long as I can get away from the base, you know, I'll take you around in my truck, show it to you, walk you through exactly how everything works. This is a huge improvement over the legacy option. The previous versions, they only ran off the map sensor, and basically it was a linear table. Boost prep, you know, 5 pounds of boost, I want the turbo position to be at this position, and so on. So unless you had a exhaust pressure sensor, you're basically going by the, you know, the feel of your seat, if it works better or not. With this setup here, it's completely what ratio do you want between exhaust pressure and boost pressure, and the controller then takes care of all the logic required to keep it back and forth. If you take your foot off the gas, it retracts in, and it's not so much the accelerator position that does that. If you're accelerating and you got 1 pound of boost and 3 pounds of exhaust, well, you know, it now knows it needs to retract in, which will lower your exhaust pressure. If it's the opposite way, it needs to push out to increase your exhaust pressure to get back and forth. Still working a little bit more. I got a couple more refinements I want to do on when your boost pressure is higher than your exhaust pressure. There's also a few resets built in, so if for whatever reason it stops calculating, if your boost pressure drops below 1 pound, it's going to reset itself, start counting again. Or if the commanded position's below your starting position, it realizes it miscounted and it'll reset itself. The whole goal is to prevent the turbo from ever being laggy, so it always needs to be wherever you programmed it to. So if you said 1-to-1, if you have 1 pound of boost, 2 pounds of exhaust, I mean, it knows it's too tight, it opens up. If you got 2 pounds of boost, 1 pound of exhaust, it knows there's not enough exhaust pressure, and it extends back out. Yeah, let me know what you guys think. It's constantly getting refined. I'm constantly modifying it. I always wanted to do new features. Like I said in my previous videos, a lot of the designs you see now really weren't my ideas. They're just ideas from various customers asking me if I ever thought about trying to do this or ever thought about trying to do that, or, you know, it works, but it's not working the way I wanted to. I always felt it could be better, and that's what drives me to constantly refine it and constantly make it best, as better as I can. Because VGTs and VNTs are the future, and I believe having a controller that's affordable for everyone, so you're not spending $4,000 on a controller to control one turbo, and then if you upgrade your turbo you gotta buy another controller. You'll have one controller that controls just about everything on the market. If it has an electronic actuator, like the whole sets, or like the S300VVs or the new Duramax, I can already control them. I can control quite a few Hella actuators. If I can't control it, send me the actuator. I can probably figure it out in about 5-10 minutes. I'm currently working on the Power Stroke and the Duramax hydraulically controlled turbos. These turbos are a little bit more tricky, but the end state is you'll be able to take a Power Stroke turbo or take the older Duramax turbos and the same thing, put them on whatever you want. The controller will basically calibrate itself to the vane position, and it'll be no different than controlling the whole set. There's actually an Isuzu turbo, it actually has I think a T4 or T6 exhaust flange, and it's a GT40 I believe, and it's hydraulically controlled. So that's also an option. It's a little bit more compact. You can rotate the intake housing, but I don't think you can rotate the exhaust housing on it. But it's definitely an option. And like I said, if you want to put any VGT, VNT, VVT, whatever you want to call it, turbocharger on anything you want because you think it's the right size but you can't control it, my Banshee VGT controllers can do it. I just may need to borrow the turbo and or just the actuator to figure out the protocol, whether if it's CAN, analog controlled, reverse polarity controlled, if it's a stepper controlled. Some are easier than others to control. Stepper motors, like on the Isuzus, they pretty much take all my ins and outs on the controller, so using them for the truck is probably not the best option. But if you have a reverse polarity controller, well, motor like some of the Hellas, that's easy enough. If you have pulse modulation, current control, I mean, there's thousands of options of control objects out there, and the Banshee can do just about every single one of them. And I don't charge difference. If you buy a Banshee today and next year you change your turbo out to something else, really it's the drop down. You just click the new drop down. My turbo is actually this, not that, and that's the end of it. It just does what it does. Yeah, like I said, my name's Steed. Feel free to give me a call if you guys have any questions. Thanks.